The next thing we kind of really want to tackle are some fundamentals of mental health in a religious tradition. Because, you'll see when we talk about intimacy and relationships later, that if you're not healthy as an individual, you can't have healthy relationships with other people. So many of you are here because you're like, how do I raise kids after a faith transition? How do I keep my marriage together after a faith tradition? How do I communicate with believing family and friends after a faith tradition? How many of you care about those things? Well, guess what? If you're not healthy, then you're starting with flat tires, right? And you're not going to drive anywhere. So this first session lays the foundation for all those other sessions. Is that all right? That's why it's next. Now, we're not advancing this all as truth, but this is our best collected wisdom for some just tools for mental health. And I want to give credit, because I believe in giving credit. This presentation comes at least from three main sources. So I read a book called A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle 12 years ago. That got me interested in secular Buddhism. So there's an underpinning there. Then when I was trained in my Psychology Ph.D., clinical and counseling psychology, I was trained in a form of psychotherapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And ACT is literally secular Buddhism woven into cognitive behavioral therapy. And so again, it's sort of secular Buddhist informed psychotherapy. So that's the main framing for today's presentation. And then a third influence, this presentation is heavily influenced by the work of Noah Rasheta and his Secular Buddhism podcast. Noah's a former Mormon Stories listener. We did workshops together, and several of these slides come directly from Noah's work. So if you really want the source of the goodness, read A New Earth and listen to the Secular Buddhism podcast with Noah Rasheta. And, some of our stuff is thrown in. So we want to answer the question, we talked about this at the break, where does situational depression come from? Where does anxiety sometimes come from? How do addictions develop? How do we get to the point where sometimes we're suicidal? And we have to make one sort of clinical distinction at the outset. There's biological anxiety. There's biological depression. There are chemically based, biologically, genetically informed forms of mental illness that are outside the purview of what we're talking about today. And so, there are degrees of mental illness that are in that category where you need to go to a psychiatrist. You need to get the medication, the therapeutic treatment that you need to get well. That's all real. We believe in that. We care about it. That's not what we're addressing today, because that's outside of we're not licensed to do a lot of that work. We're not competent to do a lot of that work. We can't replace the role of a psychiatrist or an expert in a specific field of psychotherapy, and we're not trying to. So the circle we're going to sort of put around today's presentation are things that are within our practical realm of control. Situational depression, situational anxiety, things that come out of a faith crisis that affect our mental health that we can control. Do you want to add any to that disclaimer?
Just a quick example I would give you, like when I see a scrupulosity client who came from Sunstone parents, like that doesn't fit. There's something biological going there. When I see a scrupulosity client who comes from parents who, didn't allow for you to take off your Sunday dress on Sunday, I'm like, that's probably situational. Does that make sense? So there's complexities. It's not black and white there either, but that's just kind of what we're talking about. There's things that when you wouldn't expect it are still there, and there's a lot of things that just are coming from where we're wired, and that's not what we're addressing today.
All right, so I'm going to start with the end in mind. We're going to be giving you 7 tools for for having better mental health. But I'm going to start, and you can take a picture of the slide if you want. We can provide these PowerPoints afterwards as well. But I'm going to start by the problem, and then I'm going to provide the solution right up front. 7 obstacles that today we're highlighting that I want you to start thinking. As you read through these, does any of this apply to you? Because we're going to be processing, okay? So what we're suggesting is today 7 obstacles to mental health. Obstacle number 1, avoiding things that you know you need to do. So the avoidance of what you know you need to do, that's problem number 1. Problem number 2, non-acceptance of what is. So refusing to accept reality, basically. Number 3, excessive attachment to labels and stories and even feelings. That's number 3. Number 4 is living in the past or in the future. See some heads nodding. Number 4. Number 5, disconnection from your true self. Number 6, not knowing your values. And number 7 is not living your values. Okay. Off the bat, is anybody starting to see some things they're connecting with? Okay. We'll get into it. So the flip side of this, 7 tools for better mental health. Number 1, and this is like starting with the ending, right? Recommendation number 1, do the thing that you have been avoiding that you know you need to do. That could improve your mental health. Number 2, learn to accept what is. Learn to accept reality versus resist it and try and fight it. Number 3, learn to hold labels and stories and feelings loosely instead of tightly. And I'll explain what I mean by that. 4, live in the present moment instead of in the past or the future. 5, discover your authentic self through mindfulness and meditation and other forms. Number 6, determine and write down your values. And number 7, live your values. Okay? All right? Okay. We could end now. But I'm not going to. Okay, so tool number 1, avoidance of what you know you need to do versus do the thing that you have been avoiding. All right, so acceptance commitment therapy designates the boogeyman, the bad guy psychologically, as it calls it experiential avoidance. It's basically, it can take anything from depression to anxiety to post-traumatic stress disorder to eating disorders. Take any diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the DSM-5, that is not purely rooted in biology. Take a look at any of those disorders, and what acceptance and commitment therapy would say is, at the root is experiential avoidance. And if you think about that for a second, somebody mentioned depression, right? What were you saying is the way you cope with depression? You made jokes about it. Yes, stand up and tell us. Right? And you watch Netflix and eat cookies. And what's the function?
The function is if I'm not doing those things and I don't have something to do with my life, which I don't, then I have to sit in my pain and my lack of understanding, and I just have to sit in all of the garbage that I can't explain and I don't know how to reorganize, and I have to sit in my pain is what I have to sit in.
So what I hear you say is there's pain you need to process. There are lessons you need to learn. There's growth you need to engage in, but you don't know how to do that.
Correct.
And so what depression can end up being is sleeping and Netflixing.
Naps and Netflix.
And eating away your life.
Yes.
Because you're avoiding, not intentionally.
Right.
You don't know how to do better, but you're avoiding the whatever changes or growth you need to make because you don't know. You're either too overwhelmed or it's too hard to see a way out.
And the coping mechanism makes it feeds on itself.
Right.
Like it doesn't, like sleeping doesn't help. Watching Netflix isn't making it so tomorrow I can cope.
It's avoidance.
It's complete avoidance.
It's avoidance.
Yeah.
Can we applaud her for her vulnerability? Thank you. Anxiety can be the same thing. If you think about it, I'm worrying about the past. I'm worrying about the future. What are you not doing when you're anxious? You're not actually doing anything that improves your life. So can you see how anxiety can be conceptualized as a form of avoidance? Just like depression. They're just opposite ends of the same behavior, which is not dealing with what's going on, right?
That's why they're BFFs.
That's why they're best.
They are. Anxiety and depression are BFFs.
They're BFFs.
Yes.
Together, each other. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they're opposite sides of the same coin, right?
Well, and it's probably the most common comorbid diagnosis. And by comorbid, it means you have more than one diagnosis. It sounds pretty fatal, but it's just pretty normal. We all have them. So, yeah.
They come together. Anxiety and depression often come together. People who are anxious get depressed because the anxiety wears them down. All right, so experiential avoidance is what we don't want, and when you don't take action in your life, when there's something you know you need to do, but you for whatever reason get stuck and you're not able to move forward, your brain starts pumping chemicals into your body: cortisol, stress, depression, sadness, anxiety. That's your brain sending you chemicals saying you need to make a change. You need to make a change. Make a change. Depression can be conceptualized as your brain slowing you down to take a look at what is going on in your life, to become more thoughtful about what you need to make a change about, until the point where you actually see the thing you need to change and then start acting on it. That's kind of what the functional role of depression. It's to slow you down, get you to see what you need to change, get you to concentrate on that so that you can see it and make the change. And anxiety can do something similar. That's why your brain's pumping those chemicals into your body that make you feel either super anxious or super depressed. There's a reason your brain does that. Instead of actually responding in a way that propels us forward, sometimes we just sit in the discomfort of that anxiety or depression and we try and numb it away. So instead of making the change, we self-medicate to try and numb it away. Who would be vulnerable enough to tell us your favorite form of self-medication? And we got microphones here, so just raise your hand. Who feels like they self-medicate and who's willing to share? And stand up as you say it, just so the camera can get you.
Candy.
What?
Candy. Chocolate candy.
Chocolate candy is
Ice cream.
Ice cream. Food. All right, that's vulnerable. Let's give her applause. Who else self-medicates? We need a mic runner. Can somebody play the mic runner? Medi, what's your form of self-medication?
So I have noticed this habit in myself, that if I'm having a really difficult emotional week, that what I want to do most on the weekend is spend 8 to 10 hours exercise.
Yeah.
So, and it works because you feel endorphins and adrenaline. It makes me feel good, but it also allows me to disconnect from the relationships that are causing me problems, because nobody comes and bugs me while I'm exercising, because this is important. I have to exercise right now. And so whether I have a race or not, I still sometimes have that temptation to just check out and just exercise. And then the pain afterwards is also almost as good as the exercise, because then I'm in pain. Leave me alone. I'm in pain.
Beautiful. Yeah, eating can be healthy, but if the function of the eating is to self-medicate away the pain that's being caused by you being unable to take action in a way that needs to move your life forward, something that's normally healthy like food or exercise can be turned into a form of avoidance that actually does us harm in the end. Beautiful, Medi. Thank you. Yes, Jared.
About 2 months after my shelf crashed and I started having going down that rabbit hole of learning church history and things like that was causing me problems. My dad was hit and killed by a car, And I almost feel like that accelerated my issue. And I think my self-medication was studying more and more and more to the point where
Studying what?
I was
Studying what?
church history.
History.
Studying the issues that I was having, going to the nth degree. I've probably studied 1,000 hours over the past 6 months. And it's been an obsession. I've realized it's probably an unhealthy obsession. And I feel like that has been my self-medication, is just doing that more and more and more and more. In fact, I think that's a lot of what I did to deal with my dad's death. And I've kind of shoved those feelings aside because I can just recognize that that's what I've been doing.
Oh, that's so good. Right? Like, there's a degree to which learning about church history, talking to others about church history or problems with the church is a healthy, functional, normal part of kind of deprogramming, figuring things out, and then moving forward. And then there's the extent to which it becomes, where whether it's Ex-Mormon Reddit or Mormon Stories podcast or some ex-Mormon group or friendships that you have, where that constant churning and negativity is not actually serving a healthy function for us anymore, but instead it's serving so astutely, as you acknowledge, it's serving the function of self-medication, of avoidance, of the changes that we need to make to find healing and growth and joy. And I think, how many of you have been, fallen prey to that? I think I've been your dealer. If you're junkies, I'm your dealer. I admit it, guilty. It wasn't my intent. I've got 1,150 episodes of Mormon Stories, So in some ways, I'm sorry. I apologize. It was never my intent.
Sorry, I was going to say one thing.
Green's good.
It's your voice, John. I'm sorry. It's your voice. That's the self-medication. It's the sound of your voice. It's soothing.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we move on from this slide, I don't know about how many of you, but this is definitely my Mormon stuff coming up. I'm already feeling anxious about my self-medicating. So we can very easily, in a group like this, get caught up into guilt traps, right?
Shame, yeah.
And shame. Because I know I self-medicate in several ways, right? And I can already, I don't know, maybe it's just me and I'm projecting, but I can already feel kind of the anxiety of the room, like, oh no, we're doing something wrong, right? And we've been trained well at picking up and being very hard on ourselves for doing things wrong. So I just want to normalize this a little bit. We are wired to avoid pain. We are wired for that. Every nerve ending in your body is wired to avoid pain. And the really, wonderful or shitty part of life is that we're in this constant tension between avoiding pain now, that oftentimes means we're going to have to deal with more pain later, or dealing with pain now means we get to avoid pain later. And that's a constant truth of life that we're all constantly in, that tension. So I just want to normalize this. And, and John will get really good about the ACT stuff, and what helps us with this. But just to recognize that a slide like this can definitely trigger our Mormon shame in us. And we all do it. And it's actually part of it. And I think a really good part is to recognize how our self-medicating does help us. Because Netflix does help you avoid pain in that moment. And a cookie does help you avoid. And Mormon Stories does help you avoid. And in that moment, we can give that moment grace. Because maybe in that moment, we can't face it quite yet. So let's just do a balance of that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you, Natasha. When I was doing my clinical training for my PhD, I had clients who self-harmed, who cut themselves. And that, just to be honest, my family knows this. When I envision people that I care about being harmed, I have a really strong, physically harmed, I have a really strong visceral reaction. You never want to go on a bike ride with me and my kids. You know what I'm talking about, Margi? Because I'm always don't get in the road. Come over here. Come close to the side. Because I'm to sit in front of these clients who would come to the therapy room with windbreakers on, And then they'd take off their windbreaker, and I would look at their arms, and they would just have cuts all up and down their arms, right? I was just like, it was panic-inducing for me as a therapist. Or they'd have the cuts up and down their legs. And I would have to just stare at that and think, whoa, it's my job to make them stop doing that, right? That's what I thought. And I was like imploding as a therapist, like trying to see if my clients stopped harming themselves. And then I had this really wise trainer who said, you have this completely wrong. It is not your job to get them to stop cutting. That's not your job. In fact, that might be the worst thing you could ever do. And I'm like, what? Worst thing I could ever do? That's my goal, is to get, and they said, no. Do you understand that their cutting may be keeping them alive? Because who would cut? You cut when the distress of your life is so bad that you either prefer the pain of the cutting as a distraction from the pain that you're experiencing in your life. You know, that's why you cut. And so if you take away that coping mechanism, they're left with just their pain. And then they may not want to, continue. And so never take away someone's coping mechanism unless you can help provide them with a superior form of coping. That's just a little dramatic illustration.
No, and I am cognizant that probably in the room there are people who have self-harmed, and
or who have loved ones who have self-harmed.
And I really do honor that this is what I mean by we honor the ways, even if it's cocaine or self-harm or things that culturally we see as very taboo or negative and that can have
acting out.
And can have negative consequences in your life, they also do have purpose. And I think that's always very important to ask yourself how our coping mechanisms are actually serving us. Because even if you've gotten to a point where they're serving you less than more, they still have served you. And maybe at certain times in your life, that's all you had. And we need to thank those coping mechanisms. And part of the rituals I do with people in my office is to actually thank things like self-harm, meth, whatever it was that got you to the place where you're now sitting in my office ready for a new chapter of your life. So let's be careful not to shame our coping mechanisms.
So thank your cookie.
Yes.
Thank
Margi in the back.
Netflix. Thank Mormon Stories. Thank Ex-Mormon Reddit. Margi wants to... Wait, no. You got to stand up and... Margi doesn't know the rules. Stand up and use the mic.
Okay. I'm going to do better with not in a shame way, in a growth way. I'm going to hold the microphone. Anyway, I'm so grateful that you talked about it in that way, the being thankful. One thing that I have noticed for myself and for women that I've worked with, sometimes coping skills are a little less obvious. Like perfectionism for a lot of women is actually a coping skill. So when we feel unworthy or when we feel our flaws, what do? We hustle harder. Just kind of sending a thought out there that sometimes coping skills are a little less obvious. And one thing I do see is perfectionism as being one of those. And then this idea, too, that oftentimes the coping skills that we pick up young. We're actually young when we do it, and that's something we can have a lot of compassion for. And as well as we grow in awareness, then we can choose to ask and grow in awareness around, is this really is it healthy for me? Is it working for me? And then that, I feel like it's so crucial to be able to actually thank the coping skill, to integrate that for what it did, for how it served you, and to choose to put it down and to choose to pick up something instead. It is one of the greatest, it moves me all the time in my clients. It's just one of the greatest forms of self-love for me. So anyway, just thought I would add that.
Yeah, and I have never personally been able to move on from anything in my own life in a space of self-hatred. Never. It's always actually exacerbated what I hate. And so that's why I get so angry when we talk so badly about pornography and things like that in our culture, because I just know that it's going to exacerbate the issue instead of actually heal it and help it.
So one of the coping mechanisms that I used, particularly during the time that my wife was transitioning, and I was still inside the church, was a little game that I had on my phone, and I would kind of use that as a way to check out, and particularly as my wife's law school got more intense and responsibilities at home became more intense on me, I would use that as a way to kind of cope through things. What was really interesting is that game on my phone was really bothersome to my wife, because she identified that as me trying to escape instead of dealing with whatever I was trying to escape from, the pain and everything. And we would go back and forth, and she would pretty consistently try to take that away, and I was really resistant at doing it, to the point where I would hide it from her and everything, much to what you were talking about, that whole shame aspect of not owning it as, I need this as a way just to kind of check out and escape. We have come to terms with it, but there was a second part to it that I had to realize as well. And that is where my coping mechanism, or this game, became not just a coping mechanism, but a compulsion. And where I was not using it just as a way to escape, but as something that I kind of felt drawn to more outside of escaping from pain. So that was something that I had to realize as well about my coping mechanism and how it was harming myself outside of just trying to escape.
We have Holly.
I was just kind of along the lines of what Margi said, and then I was putting myself back into me as a Mormon woman, thinking about Mormon women and thinking what I have done to self-medicate. And I think back even just to a year, 6 months ago, I was self-medicating in the church by doing everything in the church and not saying no when I needed to. And when I was asked to do a lesson or something, I would go above and beyond. I would make all the handouts. I would do everything. And I think that was a way of me self-medicating. I was on the PTA. I was getting my kids in every activity they could do. And I work full time. I was overly exercising. I was doing way too much. And this was how I was coping. And then when my shelf broke and when I realized my marriage was broken, I realized that all of these things were just a distraction for me to stay busy from my issues. And so I took myself out of the church. I stopped being obsessed with exercise. I still do it, but I added in more yoga, less of the other stuff. I took my kids out of a lot of their stuff, and I minimized my hours at work a little bit more. And so right now I am in the pain and the suffering, and it sucks. But it's working better than what I was doing before, which was running from it. So.
Beautiful. Okay, so why don't we act? Why do we avoid? And by the way, working excessively is another really, or serving, being an activist. I often make the joke or the dark joke that Mormon Stories was a huge form of avoidance for me to work on issues in my marriage. Like, I can save everyone else's marriage when in reality I was sometimes just avoiding the work that Margi and I had to do. So I love that idea all the different forms of avoidance.
Yeah, as a group, we're pretty messed up as mental health professionals. Just letting you know.
Yeah. So why don't we act? Sometimes it's because we don't know what the thing is that we need to do. So again, that's when depression or sometimes anxiety can, if we lean into it. If you saw the movie, Disney Pixar movie, Emotions.
Inside Out.
I think. The whole point of that movie was that the person needed to feel sad, but the person was pushing the sadness away. But if you go listen to the Grieving podcast that we did with Margi and Natasha, what we try and talk about is grieving is a process you lean into, not away from. Instead of self-medicating by leaning away, you lean into the sadness, you lean into the anger, you let it teach you. And part of what it's going to teach you is it's going to whisper to you what change you need to make. And so that's where the meditation, the mindfulness, the sitting with the discomfort, wisdom comes from that. That's why you do it. You don't do it to be a masochist. You do it because this pain teaches you lessons that you need to learn. And so by leaning into the pain, leaning into the anger, leaning into the distress, you hear the whisperings of the way you need to act. And then you start moving forward. So I think it's really important to also understand, and this is to motivate you a little bit, oftentimes we self-medicate or we avoid the pain of whatever that might mean. Some of you might be in a broken marriage, and so you are not dealing with your marriage because you think it's going to just be too disruptive. Or I'm not going to come out to my parents because then it'll be really painful, right? Or I'm not going to leave the church or ask to be released from my calling or whatever it is because I don't want to experience the pain of that decision. And the irony of that is that far too often, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's a relationship with the church or coming out, is that you create more pain for yourself. You simply, you basically swap some pain now for a lot of pain later. The classic example of this is the couple where one doesn't really believe and the other does, but the non-believer is scared to tell their believing spouse they don't believe anymore. So, because they don't want to deal with the pain of that conversation. And so they're traveling on the road and they take their garments off when they're on the road. They stop paying tithing, but they don't tell their spouse because they do that in secret. And then they start, they drink on the road but they want to hide that from their spouse. But then as they start growing apart, they're not feeling emotionally understood by their spouse. And so then they start confiding in other people instead of their main core partner. And over time, and then they end up betraying their spouse and making decisions that lead to a massive explosion of pain and suffering later because they were trying to avoid some of the earlier pain that would have been much more manageable.
And now we don't have a faith transitions issue, we have a betrayal and trust issue.
And that's just one example. So you see how you think it's going to be super hard now, just wait 5 years, wait 10 years. Try not to be short-sighted in this situation. So,
and can I just say one quick thing?
Yeah, please.
The research on LGBT folks really speaks to a population that has been studied very, in depth in regards of the effects of what it's like to keep a secret. And how detrimental that is to mental health. And also the research on mental health affecting your physical health has been blowing up in the last 20 years. So gastrointestinal issues, insomnia, all these things that we know, they're intricate, they're intricately connected. You cannot separate your physical health from your mental health. We used to try to do that, is that a physical problem or a mental problem? We don't do that anymore. They're intricately connected.
All those autoimmune diseases, there can be direct ties between something like being in the closet, hiding your authentic self, living a life that isn't harmonious with who you are or what your values are, and the depression and the sickness and the illness that multiplies over time as you avoid making the change that you think is going to be painful. So, so the solution, and this anything we say is going to sound glib in your lived lives, but these are just tools for you to consider. What's the alternative to experiential avoidance? It's doing the thing that you've been avoiding. It will hurt. It will hurt. It will be very, very painful. Sometimes it's not as painful as we fear. Sometimes it's worse than we ever expected. But almost always it's less painful than more time. And there's always the joy that will come after the discomfort. So the idea is a little bit of pain now or a lot of pain later. Now, there are good and bad ways to make that change, whether it's dealing with a spouse, coming out, leaving the church. You can create horrible havoc and distress and pain and suffering for you and everyone around you, or you can get help or find support and find ways to manage that more gracefully. And we should have self-compassion when we screw it all up, because we've all done that, right? But I don't want you to think we're advocating for sort of reckless, changes in your life that cause untold collateral damage. Make the change, but do it in a measured, responsible, graceful way if you can.
And as we teach you those measurable, responsive ways, you will all, as we know from previous times of doing this, you will all be like, I didn't do that. I did all this stuff you're saying I shouldn't have done. Oh my gosh, right? So the self-compassion piece is really important, because where were you supposed to learn these things? I mean, there's a manual in the church for everything except for how to lose your faith gracefully. And so, I think that we do the best we can with what we know, and you're going to know better now, and you're going to do better, and there's great power in repair attempts, which is a whole other concept we'll talk about later.
Love it. So, now's a little processing section. Can any of you identify in your life something that you've been avoiding? Ways that you're self-medicating to avoid whatever you've been avoiding, and what your sort of soul tells you, a change that you may need to make, but you just are a little bit stuck or don't know how to make it. Are any of you willing to be vulnerable about this tool number one in your life? I know this is sensitive. I know this is recorded on the internet, but does anybody have anything come up for them? Who's in a box?
Okay, so I spent my whole life avoiding. Raised in a family of violence and sexual and physical abuse, and didn't even acknowledge it happened until I was 44. Had a child at age 18 that I placed for adoption because my parents and everybody in the church told me that no man would love me if I kept the child. So I had that I told my husband before we got married, and for 30 years we never spoke of it again. Because if I were to speak of it, I would start crying, and I would never stop, is what I told myself. So I'm 44, I have 3 children, this beautiful family, and I don't even know who I am. I don't know what I believe. And all of that pain starts coming back, and so I try and be better. All I know how to do is do so much good so you can't see how bad I am. That's all I know how to do. So I started working on some healing. I went through some programs. When I was 56, so that's how many years
12.
later? 12 years later, I finally sit across from this man and tell him how much I hate myself. And it feels like I have betrayed him our whole marriage, because I never could say that to myself, much less him. And he looked at me and he said, now that you've told the truth, your real healing will begin. And that was true. So because I had built up this wall of, I have to avoid everything, so I started doing some art and art therapy, and I wrote a little bullet point book on my life story. And the very first line in the book is, I witnessed a lot of violence, I was abused, I was only a child. And I allowed my older sister to read this book, and she looked at me and she said, "You were abused?" and I had to say to her, "You lived in the same house I did." So I see that's a legacy, and I passed that same legacy to my children. They watched me avoid on my life. So now bringing them in here close is really hard because they're like, what has happened to you? You've never done this before. So it's a lot harder to avoid than it is to to face. It really is.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
So powerful. Thank you. Who else wants to share?
Hear my husband go, oh no. I think just some smaller avoidance right now is just, I know I need to start moving on. I'm avoiding just reaching out and being creating friendships and stuff. It's like I just want to stay in my house and not do that. There are people I could be friends and socialize with, but I just feel like I know what I should do every day. I need to make a few calls and do a few things and maybe reach out to my family that I've kind of scared off, and I'm just not, every day I'll work out and be like, oh, well, that's all I'll accomplish today. So maybe I'm just avoiding taking steps forward and getting on with life, with my personal life. I don't know, something like that.
How many of you relate to that? You're not alone. Thank you. Who else?
For me, after I had my faith crisis, and it was a difficult thing to go through, and I was starting to kind of make peace with some of it, or at least not feel so much deep pain with it, I told some people that were close to me and my wife, a couple people at church, like my bishop, knew about it and things like that. But it took me a long time to even talk to my parents about it. I've still really only spoken to my mom about it in detail. My father is, I can't, let him know to the degree that I don't believe anymore. And my good friend that I talk to almost every day, for 2 years I talked to them every day and didn't mention this to him. He's a member. I baptized him after my mission, and he is a member with his family and his wife and everything. And I couldn't speak to him. I avoided it. I was scared to let him know what I believe, what I've gone through, even though it was very hard and painful. There's that fear of judgment. There's that fear of what are they going to think. There's that fear of, are they going to ask questions, and am I going to make them spiral out and have a similar faith crisis? And do I want to put them through that? And so a lot of my avoidance was kind of keep it to myself, or keeping it to just a couple people, but not wanting to get it out there. It's been hard.
What did that cost you to keep it in?
It just added. It's almost like when you haven't forgiven somebody, or you haven't dealt with the problem, you're kind of burying it. You're just kind of pushing it down. It's stressful. It makes you lose sleep at night. It makes me feel like I'm not authentic. Because when I'm talking to him, I could easily mention, hey, by the way, I need to have a deeper discussion with you. But instead, I'm just going to talk about this fluffy stuff that we always talk about. So, but then you think of it later, and it's this pit in your stomach, and you have to get it out and confront it and work through it, just like a lot of things in your life. But that's one thing that was really hard for me.
How many of you relate to that? Anyone else?
Can I share?
Yeah.
You share, then I'll share.
I'm avoiding doing this.
Good.
This is so hard for me. I'm avoiding just being seen and seen for who I am. It's one of the hardest things to do. Growing up in a family that you were just expected to be a certain way, and always knowing that I wasn't necessarily that way, but trying to shape and mold myself to be how specifically my mom wanted me to be. She was very good at passive aggressiveness. There was a lot of, if she didn't like what I said, she wouldn't talk to me for a while. And so I watched my parents when my brother told them that he left. And so letting them know how painful being in the church is for me, and that it's not a happy place for me, is one of the hardest things, and I don't quite know how to do it. So I find that I'm avoiding them, and I just don't want to talk to them a lot, but then they're older, so then I'm having this guilt because I feel like you never know. Once a person's 80, you never know if you're going to lose them. And so I just constantly feel this tug of war of I don't want them to know where I'm really at, and so I avoid. And same with my sister, who's my best friend, so I relate well with what you're saying about, they're your best friend and you talk to them on a daily basis, but she has no idea the depth of the pain that I've been through in the last 2 years. And so it's interesting because I'm avoiding a lot of other things in my life, avoiding changing careers, and I feel like a lot of that's surrounded about just trying to be not seen and just kind of fly under the radar. So that's...
You all are emotional gladiators, and I just have to say, Natasha was like, I want to go. Can I go? So Natasha wants to go now.
I can go, right? Well, and before I even share, I think the reason, I think we're trained to not share a lot about our lives, as mental health professionals, because when we do that, it kind of takes away from your story, or we're projecting our story onto you, and that's inappropriate. At the same time, I think that there are reasons and times when it's therapeutic or part of the kind of intervention to share. And one of the things I think both John and I are very cognizant of is that it's very easy, again, because we come from a culture that pedestalizes people in authority. It's very easy to assume that we have it all figured out, and that because we're teaching you these concepts, we must be super expert in living these concepts in our own lives. So I'm going to share in the spirit of letting you know that I too am effed up in many ways. And, I have given this presentation with John for 3 years, knowing that I'm avoiding a big, big thing in my life. And it's hard to sit in a place where you feel like super hypocritical, knowing that. And my move to Utah and this coming December means that I finally had to sit with my husband, and we had to face things about our marriage and about our gender roles and about our Mormonism that we have avoided for 24 years. So I feel super supported and loved by him in ways that we haven't felt before, and at the same time we're in a huge ambiguous spot of what's going to happen next. And so this is real, and just because we know it doesn't mean we always do it. And I share just because I want to say it's not just theoretical stuff, it's personal stuff, and we've lived it too, right, in different ways. And so hopefully we're not some experts that are unapproachable or somehow better than. We are just as messed up and just as much in the fray of all of this as you are. And so I just share in that spirit.
Just as messed up or more.
Or more, yeah.
Or more.
They actually tell us that when we start graduate school. People who are attracted to this profession are really messed up, and we're all looking at each other like, oh, thanks.
Okay, so you will get a lot more out of this weekend if you identify, something you've been avoiding and set a goal for yourself to make a change in a responsible way. And so think about that. We're just going to leave that with you. At the end of Sunday, when we kind of have a close, we're going to ask each of you to share something you learned or something you're going to change. And most importantly, as you walk away from this weekend, try and keep little notes of like things you want to change or insights you have about yourself. And I want to invite you to identify changes that you might be avoiding that might be really helpful to you. We need a mic. Thank you.
If I'm avoiding talking to people and avoiding talking to my friends and avoiding talking to my husband, how do I prioritize which of the myriad of things I am avoiding to tackle first? Because I feel like all of these things I'm avoiding. So how do I pinpoint what I need to work on when everything applies to me?
Do you want me to take it?
Either one.
Well, what we are going to talk, our next presentation, I think after this, is talking about emotional intimacy. And I think we will talk about somewhat like prioritizing relationships in your life. And all of us in many ways are facing elephants we need to eat. And you can only do that one bite at a time. So I think it's actually very wise of you to know intrinsically that you're overwhelmed, it sounds like, and that you might have to temporarily, I know this word might be triggering, but we temporarily shelf a few things correctly to be able to deal with a few things at a time. It's not realistic to do it all at once. And so to have grace for yourself in that process, I think is really important. Those are just a few thoughts I have.
And I'll just, reflecting on Natasha's vulnerability, our family spent between $7,000 and $10,000 last year in coaching and therapy. Think about that. I have a Ph.D., 6 years of clinical and counseling psychology. I am a coach, and Margi and I, spent between $7,000 and $10,000 last year in therapy and or coaching for me, Margi, several of our kids individually, and we've even had therapy as an entire family. So to just piggyback on your vulnerability, find one way that it can help you can prioritize and figure out which bite of the elephant to start with is through the multiple numbers of therapists and coaches that are emerging from our community who are willing to help, whether it's Natasha, whether it's Margi. Tell us your name again. Shannon. Shannon's a marriage and family therapist. Go to the Mormon Mental Health Association. There's a great list there. Symmetry Solutions, which is a little network. Natasha, find a competent therapist or coach to help. We are big believers in that, and we invest in that, and we encourage that as one way.
And it's a really good way to use a weekend like this is to know that it's going to have its limitations, right? Like we are talking to kind of like general conference, right? In generalities, in ways that, might affect most of you, but you all have your own individual stories and relationships and complexities that a weekend like this will never be able to completely address, right? And so that's where the individual coaching hopefully helps you then take the principles you're learning here and really apply them into your life. So, yeah. And if you don't have resources for that, because I know that's an issue for a lot of people, we do have community centers. That's why we're trying to have a myriad of resources, because I know mental health help isn't accessible to everybody, and that's just a travesty in our current country.
Microphone.
I just want to say one of the complications to being able to get help is, I know for me, is an aversion to anything that looks like I'm trying to perfect myself again. Mm-hmm. And so even if that's actually how I could get to a better mental health place, it looks too much like I'm working on myself again. I've got more list of how I need to be better, and I'm, instead of paying the church, I'm paying somebody else to walk me through how to be better. And so it's enormously triggering to even get started, and you throw in there not having gained a sense of trust for yourself, and a fear of being taken advantage of again, because any sort of work you do in this area, you're going to have to be vulnerable and open yourself up, and it leaves space for people to take advantage of that. And so I think that's an added complexity and hardship that some of us will face in even getting started.
Thank you. Can I respond to that really fast? This is where I think what's so complex is that there is truth from where we come from. Like the idea of eternal progression, we're all progressing, right? We're all growing. And when that's been held hostage in a way that scares the hell out of us, that we're not good enough, that we're ever going to make it into a certain place, that true concept has been hijacked to make us feel like shit about ourselves. And so extricating what's true from how it's been used in really untruthful ways is a real challenge. So I totally get that. I mean, I don't know what to say other than amen, sister. I think that that's really hard. But there is something beautiful, and this is where I have found my yes and is yes, I am wonderful just the way I am right this second in all my imperfections and flaws. And I want to, grow and learn and progress. And can I hold those two truths at the same time? Thank you.
One more second.
Sorry, you wanted to say something.
One final thing.
I'm not just in charge here.
So there are good therapists and coaches and there are bad ones. And I could have started life coaching as soon as I started Mormon Stories. I didn't. I went back and got 6 years of a clinical and counseling Ph.D. because even if I ended up coaching, I wanted the professional clinical training that would inform how I worked with people. One of the things I'm very grateful for is the ethical code that we are taught as professionals, as social workers, marriage and family therapists, or psychologists. And any of you who have done coaching with me, you will know that when I begin my coaching relationship with you, there are a couple things that I guarantee. Confidentiality, and that my allegiance is to the ethical values of my client, not to impose my own values on my client. And another way to say that I hope the people that I coach with will agree, is that my goal isn't to become their new authority figure. I explicitly work with my clients to tell them, our job is to cultivate within you your own moral authority, your own intrinsic sense of right and wrong. And I'm doing my job as a coach if you become your new authority. And I only say that because I want to help you become educated consumers of therapists and coaches. If your coach is nudging you or pressuring you or imposing values or trying to push you in any direction, that is the surest sign they're that they're engaging in malpractice. So look for people who are committed to the ethical position of finding out what you want to do with your life and then just helping you remove the obstacles and pursue what means to you. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's why the Mormon Mental Health Association, that's why Natasha created it, because she vets every therapist on that list to make sure they're not going to say, you need to stay in the church, or you need to leave the church. Beware of any therapist that tells you either thing. I invite you to punish me in severe ways if you ever find out that I told a client, you need to leave that church. I will never do that. But I will also never tell a client to stay in the church. I will ask a client, tell me how it's working for you. What feels right for you? What do you want to do? Now, how can we help you get that? So it's just a tip. But if you find a really competent, trained professional, they won't do what has been done to you by unhealthy organizations.
And it's a learning process for us, too, because I will say that even as you're saying that, I can think of 3 clients who rightfully fired me when I crossed that boundary. Probably on issues we would all agree on, but it's still not appropriate for me to do that. And so they rightfully fired me, and then I had to go to my own supervision and think through that. And, so we are, even competent professionals are constantly challenged in these ways. And you might be with a professional at a certain time of their professional development where it's not a good fit. So trust that. Find somebody else.
Word of mouth is good. Asking around for professionals who have been very helpful for other people like you can really, really useful. So, or just use Natasha, or Margi.
Except for it's one of those times when you need to fire me then.
Okay, Karen, please.
Okay, so I'm thinking about your comment, and I understand where you're coming from with that. I feel like as a 50-year-old woman that there are developmental things places that I should be at 50 in my life, that other people, I'm around other people who have never been LDS, and there are things they understand and they know, and I feel so behind, and sometimes it's really overwhelming. Like, I haven't really handled finances. Sometimes I'm scared to go to the mailbox to pick up my mail. That's the most ridiculous thing to be afraid of, and sometimes I can avoid for days going to my mailbox. So I love what Natasha says about just being kind of gracious with yourself, because I think what we've gone through is something really, really, really big, and we can look really normal on the outside, but inside we can just be kind of shattered. So I would say, this is my own thing, do the easiest thing that you can pull your head out of the sand on, and then you get to have that win, and then go to the next easiest thing and pull your head out and just have a lot of grace. A lot of people have had 50 years of normal progression in their lives to get where they are. Until I was 46, I didn't know the difference between champagne and wine. Like, that's just ridiculous for a 56-year-old woman to not know that. And so there's 46, sorry. 46. So, but you understand what I'm trying to say. So there's a lot of reason for us to have anxiety about really normal things. And it's not that we're stupid or that we're really backward, or maybe we are. It's just there's a reason for us being backward, and it's okay.
That's so beautiful.
And that really touches me, because I turned 40 in January, and I feel like a child, and I don't know how to cope with that. I feel like a child that doesn't know about life and doesn't know how to function outside of this thing, that feeling like a child when I'm almost 40. Like, looking at you guys, I'm like, oh, you're all so much wiser, and you know so much more, and I'm just this idiot that can only take naps and watch Netflix because I don't know how to cope with life. Like, it's hard to be a baby when you're an adult.
It's born again.
And I just want to say, as a young person who is a therapist of a lot of women in your position, it's not fair that because I haven't been married and don't have kids, I have been able to pursue an education and been able to pursue all this like personal development stuff that I see you guys, and I'm like, you haven't had that chance too. So, but if you're the people I'll turn to for any advice that I need on like marriage stuff or on like raising kids stuff, because that stuff I'm a complete baby about. So like I think it's all like just how you look at it. But like don't feel bad for not knowing that stuff, because you guys have been busy in like something else way important that I know nothing about.
Love it. This is so great. Thank you, all of you. Okay, tool number 2. Tool number 2, acceptance of what is versus non-acceptance of what is. This is classic Buddhism, okay? Let me go back for just a second. Do you guys know the founding premise of Buddhism? You can reduce Buddhism to 3 words. What's the founding premise of Buddhism? Say it loudly. Life is suffering.
Yay!
Now, why in the world? Yeah, woohoo! Yeah, awesome! Can you imagine Buddhist missionaries? Toot, 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 toot. We have a message to you today. Life is suffering, you know. What's the wisdom in starting with that premise? We need a microphone.
The comfort I have in that is hearing all these vulnerable stories and seeing that it's not just me. I'm not the only broken one. If that's the basis, if all of it is suffering, then I know that when I'm going through suffering, it's not because I'm broken or I'm a terrible person or I did something wrong, which those may be elements of truths to what I'm going through. But like we talked about earlier, that's just the human condition. That's just what everyone is going to experience, and I shouldn't other myself or feel like I am not worthy of anything or I'm not a human just because I'm going through suffering.
Beautiful. There's a book that's worth the whole book just from the title. You don't even have to buy the book, but the book is also good. The book's called The Happiness Trap. And it's important as you're thinking about your mental health to understand the happiness trap. The happiness trap is the idea that life is supposed to be happy all the time. It's a trap. Because then you wake up every morning saying, today's going to be a great day because I'm supposed to be happy. And life's great, right? And then all of a sudden something crappy happens. Then you're like, oh my gosh, that sucks. Wait a minute. I thought life was going to be happy, and now I'm sad. And then another bad thing happens. And then because you're sad and you're discouraged, you start self-medicating and avoiding and feeling anxious. And then you try and avoid more sadness, and you try and micromanage your life so that nothing bad happens. Or you stay home so you can avoid more bad happens. And then more bad things happen because your life gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you get sucked down into depression or anxiety, worrying about trying to avoid the next unhappy thing. And it's a happiness trap. The more you try and make yourself happy, the more miserable it often makes you. Does that make sense? And that's a trap that we're all in. That's kind of a religious trap. When they sell you that the purpose of life is happiness. No, pursuing happiness will more often guarantee misery than not. So what's the alternative? The alternative is what Buddhism teaches, which is, no, start with the premise that life is suffering. Life is a struggle. Life is messy. Life is problematic. Every day, there's going to be huge problems that face you. And if you start with that expectation and premise, number one, it's realistic. So you're grounded in reality. And number two, you're pleasantly surprised when something good happens. And it's like icing on the cake. But it's a totally different psychological energy. Someone get a microphone back to Margi. It's completely different psychological energy. And all that ties back to this notion of acceptance. Acceptance of suffering actually leads to more joy and well-being. Resistance of what is, which is suffering, leads to more suffering. Margi, please stand up. And then...
I also really like that it says life is suffering. I think it's super healthy for those of us. I remember after we were excommunicated, this intense pressure of feeling like if I suffered, then I'm reaffirming what everyone thinks when you leave. Like, oh, life will just completely fall apart because you've left. And I do feel like sometimes there's an inherent message and a false promise in the church that if you make all the right decisions, you will be protected. Suffering happens to you. And I think it goes back to sort of like, well, are you praying? Are you like the long list of things that no one can ever do at the same time because the list goes on and on. But there's that inherent message, right? That why are we suffering? Well, we're not doing something on the list. Clearly it's me. And I love this because it's like, no, why do we suffer? Because we're alive. That's why we suffer. It's not because of what we've done. It's not because we're inherently wrong. It's because we're alive.
Beautiful. Thank you, Margi. Yes.
From my experience...
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay. From my experience, it's not the suffering that causes pain. It's the avoidance of the suffering that causes pain.
Right.
And it's in that we get it wrong. We try and avoid the pain, and in essence, it's just that. It's the idea that the avoidance causes the pain and not the suffering.
Beautiful. So, Camille.
What's your name? This is to Jessica. I'm having a realization here that of my own avoidance. So you can avoid with Netflix. You can also avoid with law school. And I really don't think one is better than the other. I mean, really. Maybe you're thinking that, we're probably just being here and seeing that we both did the exact same thing is kind of creepy, I said from the onset. And it's giving me some realizations about avoidance. The fact that my bike's on that back wall, I guess everyone else sees me walk in is like, whoa, she's pathological. And maybe I really am. So, I got exposed to this idea that there's like this quadrant. Is this like a psychological principle, the walled off versus that you're like one of these quadrants, and right in the middle is healthy self-esteem. But just because I go batshit crazy and run off and leave my family and go to law school is no better of a form of avoidance than eating cookies and Netflix or just exercising like crazy the world affirms what I did, and I have a law degree now, but I really don't think I'm anywhere closer to that self-esteem core than you are. So there's that.
Wow.
And I just want to say that so I know that as Mormons, we take happy pills. Like, that's the big important thing, right? Is everybody's got to be happy, happy, happy. And no matter what you're doing, you've got to present as happy. At the same time, if I could have like $1 for every client who I've asked what your goals are to come into therapy, and they will just say, I just want to be happy. And it doesn't really matter what tradition they come from. That's the deal. And when you think about how the whole media industry and advertising industry in this country is based on selling you happiness, it's a universal problem, right? It's maybe, in countries where they have more Buddhism, it's not as much of a problem. But I think definitely here in this Christian country where we've been made to hustle for our worth, it's definitely something we think that we should be able to earn is happiness through our actions and our behaviors. And so that's a lie. And that's, I guess, just what I want to say. I want to say I think it's bigger than just a Mormon issue.
100%. Yeah. And even... Yeah, you can clap at that. Yeah, absolutely. And what are the Buddhist countries like Thailand or I don't even know, China? Like, I don't know that they're necessarily beacons of happiness either. Like, it's the human condition. Certainly not Mormon condition. A couple slides. Yes, go ahead.
So what do you do with the fact that all of your friends that see that you're struggling with things, and my mother also sees that I've been struggling with things, they always say to you, well, we just want you to be happy. We just want you to be happy. Why can't you just be happy? And even sorry, honey, but he says that to me all the time too. I just want you to be happy. Can't you be happy? No, I can't. I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. I'm taking the antidepressants. I'm on the anti-anxiety. I've been for 12 years. It's going to be a lifetime argument. It's going to be a whole fight for the rest of my life. It's just in my family. It's just going to be there. It's like me being a diabetic. I'm going to have to take crap. But I'm tired of everybody asking me to just be happy.
Yeah.
I'm tired of it.
Yeah.
I'm sad. I'm depressed. And I've got lots of good reasons for it.
Yeah.
Lots of good. I want to be validated.
Yeah.
And I want to be supported in my sadness.
Yeah. And honestly, when we talk, thank you. When we talk about you guys having your own wisdom, you know that is what you should tell your friends and family members that are safe, that really care. You should tell them exactly what you just said.
I never said that to him. No.
Wait. Stand up.
Okay, I have said that to you, but usually it's in a fight. And no, it is. Usually it's not. It's heated because he wants to make me happy, and he works really hard at that. And he's you couldn't ask for a better husband. And we've been married 31 years tomorrow, and together for 32. He is everything my father was not. He is hands-on in every way. Great dad, great husband, unselfish lover.
Tell us
all
more.
The great things.
Tell us
all
more.
the wonderful things. But I feel a lot of guilt because I'm not happy for him, because I know he works so hard to make me happy. Yeah. And I want to be happy for him, not even for me. I'd rather be happy for him because I can see him working so hard at it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Just one quick response. A lot of times, number one, I just want to reiterate, for the people who are safe, you should say exactly what you told us, which is I want you to sit with me in my sadness. I don't want you to offer me reassurance. I don't want you to try and push me on to some other state. I want you to sit with me and hold my sadness with me and not nudge me and just be there with me. Like that's, you know, you had the answer inside of you. And for the safe people, that's what you need to say. For the unsafe people, usually they're not actually saying they want you to be happy. What they're saying is that your state makes them uncomfortable. And they're saying, fix whatever you need to fix because you're making me uncomfortable. But they don't say that. What they say is, we just want you to be happy. And that's a way that we self-protect. They're self-protecting. They're avoiding, maybe. And you're doing the real work, or at least you're here. You're engaged in the fight. So kudos to you for sitting in your sadness, owning it, and seeing how you can grow from it. So kudos to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly that there's a lot of pressure on women, not just in Mormonism, but in society in general, for us to smile all the time, for us to be grateful all the time, just to constantly reaffirm what society thinks we should be feeling. And if all of us women truly actually shared what we feel like, medicated or unmedicated, what we still feel like, it's really disruptive to what we have built. It denies the narrative, whatever that is. If it's the church's narrative, if it's our country's narrative of the American dream and all of that, and various other narratives. And so I think for ultimately women to actually self-actualize, we need a period of time of essentially mourning. And that's what it looks like.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Pleasant and pretty.
Yeah. Keep sweet, right? Yeah. Okay, so a couple little sub-tools in the acceptance tool bag. A lot of these come from either ACT or NOAA. And some of these we've already talked about. So there's the Tetris exercise, and this, Margi, is getting to what you were talking about. You know, if any, have you played Tetris? So Noah, this comes from Noah Rasheta. You know, when the little blocks are coming down, you want to fit them in the right place, right? But sometimes you get the wrong block, or sometimes they start coming faster than you want. And you start feeling anxiety that you're not able to get the right blocks in the right places. How much sense does it make to start screaming at the Tetris game, saying, how dare you give me the wrong block, and this is the wrong shape, and now they're coming too fast. Oh, I'm terrible, and you're terrible, and this is terrible, right? No one would do that, right?
Well, we might.
You might. Actually, we do. Yeah, actually, we do that, right? But it's not, but what this teaching of acceptance is trying to drive home the point that it's not personal, right? This is the game of life. The game of life involves weird shaped pieces coming down at a velocity uncomfortable to us. In other words, suffering, right? And we can either accept that and just go with the game, or we can rage at it. And how effective are we going to be at placing that next piece while we're screaming at the computer screen, shaking our fists, right? So acceptance actually helps us deal more elegantly with the life that we've been given versus the non-acceptance, the raging, the disappointment, the shame, making it so we just compound the distress. And that gets us to your point about the arrows and suffering, right? So there's this difference between pain and suffering. The story that Noah tells that comes from the Buddhist tradition is of the prince who's walking through the forest with an entourage, and he's shot with an arrow. Okay? And the arrow's lodged in his chest. If he doesn't do something with it, he's surely going to die. And yet, what does he do because of his pride or because of his ego? He commands his entourage, take a sample of the wood from this shaft and go search the forest for all the trees to see where this arrow came from, because maybe if we can find the source of the wood for the shaft of the arrow, we can figure out who it is that shot me. And take a sample of the feather from the end of the arrow. Go sample every chicken in the forest and in the kingdom to find out where the feather came from, because then maybe we can find out who shot me with the arrow, right? Well, what's the prince forgetting?
He's shot with an arrow.
That he's shot with an arrow and he's going to die, right? So, and sure enough in the story, as he's wasting time obsessing about the first arrow that he got shot with, he gets shot by the second arrow, right? So the first arrow represents the pain that life is inevitably going to give you, that you do better to accept than to avoid or not accept. The second arrow represents the suffering that's compounded by your non-acceptance of the pain that life provides. Does that make sense? The first arrow is the inevitable pain that life will give you. The second arrow is the suffering you add to that initial pain by refusing to accept what is. And the best example I have of that in the Mormon context is what's called the Nephi Effect. And you all, well, many of you have been guilty of this. The stereotype of people who leave the church is that they, what? Were weak, wanted to sin, stopped praying, stopped reading the scriptures, were offended, right? Looked at porn, like whatever it is, right? The truth is, most of the people that end up in these chairs in front of us are people who were the opposite. They were the people who cared so much, not who cared so little. Raise your hands if you were a zone leader or AP on your mission. Raise your hand if you've been in Relief Society or primary presidency. Raise your hand if you were in a bishopric or whatever. It's kind of a stake high calling, right? These are, in many cases, what Marlon Jensen called the best and the brightest in the church. And part of the hustling for worth that we all became victims of is this idea of wanting to be Nephi, wanting to be noble, wanting to be great, and learning this conditional love where everybody, our parents and our leaders, pat us on the head and say, good girl, good boy, you're doing righteous things, you're being obedient, you're following the path. And we get connected to that adoration and that affirmation that our parents and the church provides. And so when we lose our faith, immediately we lose our status as the noble one, as the great one, as the good child, right? As the valiant ward member, as the exemplary wife or husband or mom or dad, right? And so when we then look at these ward members or parents or siblings who no longer think we're wonderful, we've downgraded in their estimation of worth. Instead of just saying, yeah, I'm downgraded in the eyes of my loved ones, and that's terrible, and that's just the way it is. What we do is we say, no, I won't accept that. So instead, I'm going to shove the CES letter in their face, and I'm going to bring up Peepstones and Book of Abraham and Fanny Alger at every single family get-together that I can. Or I'm going to needle my spouse every little chance I get with all the problems with the church, because we think we're doing it because we want to help enlighten them. We want to educate them. We want to save them from the pain that we want to help them see the world clearly, right? What we're really doing is we're basically refusing to accept that they no longer view us as an elevated, noble, and great person. We're resisting that, and instead we're trying to force them to respect us. And just like that first arrow is the initial disappointment of no longer being daddy's little valiant girl or mommy's valiant son, right? Instead of just sitting with that reality that we will never be viewed with as much respect by our believing loved ones, that's gone. You could win the Nobel Peace Prize and cure cancer, and you will be viewed as a disappointment by your believing loved ones.
These are true stories. Yeah.
That's the first arrow. The second arrow is when we wreck every meaningful relationship, trying to force them to return to that level of respect for us. That's the second arrow. That's refusing to accept what is. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Imagine this awful monster across this awful pit, and you find yourself pulling on this rope, and the monster's pulling back. And the harder you pull on the rope to pull the monster in the hole, the monster's pulling you back just as hard. And your hands are getting calloused, and your hands are getting bloody, and you're getting exhausted by the effort to change what is. What escape is there? Because if you don't keep pulling, you're going to get pulled into that hole. What options do you have?
Let go of the rope.
Let go of the rope. And another word for letting go of the rope is what? What? Detachment. And another word for detachment is acceptance. Accepting. It's something that sometimes doesn't occur to us as a possibility. And so I ask you, what is your rope? What problem are you strengthening by not accepting? And I got this from Eckhart Tolle. That which you fight, you what? Who's an Eckhart Tolle fan? What? That which you fight, you strengthen. That which you resist, what? Persists. That comes from A New Earth. So that's the question for all of you right now as we process. What reality are you refusing to exist that is actually strengthening the problem and that is adding that second arrow of suffering to the pain that you're already experiencing? Do you want to jump in on that before?
No, I think you've done excellent.
Anyone? Does this speak to you? Yes. Stand up.
I will share. So I've been crying through this thing because my loss of who I thought God was. My relationship with Him has really been painful, and I don't sit at home. It's been 3 months since I lost my testimony, and but I have been trying to let go. Obviously, I'm still holding on to that. I've just pushed it to the side, and I'm not dealing with it. But I'm trying to let go and accept what is, I guess, that who I thought God was is not who He is, if He even exists. And I do believe that there's something, I don't know what it is, and I have to redefine that. What I'm feeling in my heart, those past spiritual experiences I had with God. But I do, when I have those moments, I read whatever his name is, Eckhart Tolle, and when I listen to secular Buddhism, I feel that peace come back, and it's filling the hole, but I need more time to process it. But yes, I understand that the pain goes away when I do let go. And I'm trying to do that better.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else?
The Nephi Effect really spoke to me. I have a 16-year-old daughter. I feel like I've disappointed my wife already. My kids don't know that I've even questioned the church. And I've actually had major panic attacks about thinking about my daughter viewing me as less status as a priesthood holder. That's probably my biggest thing. The hardest thing with this whole journey is not just her, but extended family, and I'm sure we can all relate probably to some extent with that. But that's the problem that I'm holding on to, that I need to address. That I can't. The acceptance thing just really spoke to me, because I can't accept that right now in my life, and that's what I think needs to happen in order to move forward, is to just accept that is going to be okay. I can't wrap my head around it right now.
Thank you.
I just want to validate that I think, the mixed faith marriage stuff is really hard. But when it comes to our Papa Bear and Mama Bear instincts, I don't know if there's anything harder than that in this whole process. So I just want to validate that fear.
What's ironic about that for me, my dad was a police officer, and he's 85, and he's old school in so many ways. And he taught, say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, and life is about respect, and you respect your elders. And I've tried to bring that to my kids sometimes, and Margi will attest to this, where it's just like, those kids don't respect me. You know what I mean? But what I've learned is the more I try and get them to respect me, the more I alienate them, and the more they disrespect me. You can't force respect. It's something that somehow you earn through intimacy and connection, and we'll talk about that in our conscious parenting session. But that's where acceptance, maybe they are going to look down on you for a time. Maybe they are going to see you as a disappointment. But the alternative is that second arrow of like trying to force them to respect your faith journey or where you are when they can't see that. You're actually you're gonna make it worse, and that's hard. So it's better to sit with the discomfort of the first arrow than invite that second arrow by trying to force respect that has to come organically if it ever comes. Yeah, thank you.
You did a Mormon Stories podcast, and it was the first one that I watched when I was questioning my faith. I think there was a man named Clay
Christensen.
And there was somebody else.
Matt Elgren.
Yes, and he was, in his relationship, had not spoken up about, or he just sort of kept quiet. And, this was before I had spoken to anybody really about my doubts. And I was watching this, and it broke my heart to see this man say, well, I've been like this. I haven't believed for
12 years.
Yes. And I was like, especially when you come to the realization, for those who do, that, okay, this isn't real, and potentially that means there's no heaven, all of a sudden time becomes extremely precious. Time with family, time with children, your own time in your own life. And so I saw this man in your podcast, and I was like, I can't let that happen to me, because how are you living? And so I agree with you that we do need to accept that people will choose other things from us, even our loved ones. And we need to give them space to choose that and understand that, and take them at their word that they are happy doing that if they choose to stay in the church, and if that's our spouse or whomever. But that we also need to find the words to say, that while they may now respect us less, they still need to see us. And that we still we don't have to censor ourselves. We can be respectful, but we don't have to do what I saw. And that really terrified me and made me realize, the key is just relearning how to talk.
Beautiful. And we're going to have a whole section on communicating with believing family and friends, and that's exactly what we're going to get to, is how to do that. Karen, did you want to say one more thing?
One thing to you. And Jared, this probably won't be anything that happens in your life, but I had the most Peter priesthood son. Kind of thought he was gay, but guess what? He was actually really my daughter. And if I had not left the church, that child would have gone on a mission, would have married in the temple, would have lived a false life. So, and then the damage would have been really catastrophic when she was older and came out and had children and a family. So while your daughter might have a hard time in the beginning, your daughter might bless your name for having the courage to stand up when you did, because there might come a time in her life where she will be able to talk to you and know that you will love her and that you will accept her and you won't judge her. And you couldn't possibly know that now. So you are so kind and lovely. Your family's so lucky to have you, and you're going to do this great.
Anyone else have something they're not, that they're strengthening by not accepting, that they want to share? Yes. We have a first-time commenter. Alex.
I am a first-time commenter. I'm not good at this, so bear with me. But like I shared a little bit last night, I spent 25 years keeping a deep, dark secret that I didn't want anyone to know. And it took 25 years to finally let go of the rope and get some help. And even then, walking into that therapist's office, the last thing I ever wanted to do. It still took a year after that till I finally told him everything that was going on with me. And it's only been within the last 6 months that I've learned to drop that rope. And I was one of those clients that walked in and said, I want to be happy. I want to learn how to be happy. And what I've realized lately is I want to learn how to be me, and whatever that means. And sometimes that is being sad and being mad. That's part of life is suffering. And so as I've learned that, and now with a faith transition, I've seen a lot of the pain that my mental health issues have caused my wife. And one of the fears that I have is I don't want to do that to her again. But I'm not, I'm trying to shelter her by not sharing my feelings and being vulnerable. And so it's something that, just recently I've started to learn to do through a lot of therapy. And I think it's making a difference. And hopefully will make a better, stronger marriage. And so, it is okay to be mad, to be upset. With my diagnosis, I'm less than 1% of the population has what I do. So you could say, kind of like a Mormon in the world. But I've embraced. See, there we go. Took a minute to catch on that one. But I've learned to embrace that I'm different, and it's okay to be different, and it's okay to be sad, and the ones that do love you will embrace you and accept you for who you are. So.
All right, tool number 3. We're doing good.
3 hours later.
Tool number 3, hold labels, stories, and feelings loosely versus holding them tightly. And I'm guessing this might sound abstract to you, but let me explain, or let me at least try to. So our brains have certain abilities or capacities, okay? Our brains create language. We have memories, right? We create stories and narratives from our lives. We label things, good, bad, big, small, scary, worthy, right? So we have words, we have language, we have stories, and all that is stuff generated from our brains. Our brains are like little factories that generate labels, that do assessments, that create stories, that try to make meaning. And I had this weird awakening just the other day. I was asleep, but my brain was going crazy. And I had this brief moment of realizing, I can't believe how much work my brain has been doing while I've been asleep. Because I was in that phase of almost waking up, but not quite. And my brain was like, what do I got to do today at work? And I've forgotten about this, and I haven't been nice to this person. I got to apologize. And I'm just and by the time I wake up, I'm like, who's been doing all that work? I was asleep. But see, it's healthy to realize that you are separate from your brain. You are not your brain. You, if there's a you, if it's your spirit, if it's your soul, if it's your consciousness, whatever you call it, doesn't have to be metaphysical. You are the noticer. You are the conscious being that notices things, that's an observer, right? Your brain is the thing that generates labels and words and makes assessments and thinks and feels and generates feelings. But you are not your feelings. You are not your labels. You are not the stories that you weave. Other people are not the labels you give them. Other people are not the stories that you impose upon them. Right? Your feelings and your labels and the stories are separate from you. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is it can be unhealthy to become too attached to any label, to any story, to any feeling that you are experiencing. And it can be healthy to learn to create distance between the stories that you tell yourself, the labels that you give yourself, the labels that you give other people, right? And the feelings that you have. When you say, I'm depressed, what's the problem with that construct? I am depressed. What's the problem with that? What's wrong with that? Who wants to say? What's wrong with saying, I am depressed? Stand up.
When you say I am, you're basically saying that's everything I am, that I am depressed. So I am is a powerful statement in itself. And so it just makes it so then you become more depressed because then you're telling your brain that's what I am, is depressed.
Yeah. It's like assuming an identity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what would be and this is there's a bigger point here than just like how we construct sentences, but just for the sake of it, what would be maybe a bit more of a healthy way to express what someone might be trying to express when they say, I'm depressed?
I have depression. I deal with depression. It's something that happens in my life.
Yeah.
It's how I
feel sad. I feel
sad.
depressed sometimes. Yeah. I have a diagnosis of depression, whatever. Do you notice the difference? It's creating a little bit of a distance between you and, in this case, the feeling you're having.
Yeah.
Instead of making it an identity,
Right.
it's who I am.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start cloaking yourself in negative descriptors, you're starting to wear kind of a victim mentality, which in and of itself can become a position of vulnerability and weakness instead of one of strength.
And this is something that is a huge, huge one for me. And I feel like when I understood this concept, it was life-changing for me because everything I did, I labeled. And it was always, I don't have enough energy. I am not going and helping at this thing. I am not a patient enough mom. And then even to the point where I am a Mormon, I am a Utahn, and then people would say bad things about Utah, and it became, well, then I am a Utahn. So I couldn't, it was so intertwined to hear, people say things that were not nice about Utahns, and I took that as myself. And, I just did this a lot. So I've learned how to be able to distance myself from that. It still comes back, but I recognize it when I do that. So it's
Beautiful.
Powerful.
Beautiful. Noah taught me this principle of labels and stories, how they can be chains. They can bind you. Right? I am a Mormon. I am an ex-Mormon. I am depressed. I am noble. I am courageous. I'm an activist, right? What Noah said, paraphrasing, is negative labels and stories are like lead chains, but positive labels and stories can be like gold chains. But in the end, both can be binding or limiting. Now, can any of you women out there relate to how positive labels can become golden chains? Okay, in the back, and then Holly.
Oh, I was going to say.
Anyone?
I just said I totally relate.
Wait, was that your husband? Did you want to say something? No. Okay, Holly raised her hand.
I was just thinking about when I was in the church. I spent a ton of time in the young women's, and so in my head repetitively is, I am a daughter of Heavenly Father who loves me and I love him. I will stand as a witness of God at all times and in all things, in all places. And I did that. I was a missionary, and I was a missionary my whole life. Everywhere we lived, I was a missionary. I literally would go places and put that tag on myself. I would start groups with women, and I was the Mormon girl. I made myself this, I labeled myself to be this. And so when I lost that, it was like, who am I? And that's where I am right now, trying to figure out, that label aside, who am I?
Beautiful. Thank you. Anybody else being weighed down by negative or positive labels or stories or feelings? Stand up. Nope.
I want to be the one that's always talking. But it's almost like when someone's telling you, you are the party girl of the ward. You're the one that throws the parties. You're the one that does this. You're the creative one. What would we do without you if you don't help us with the ward float? I don't know. Those of you that know about miniature parades in Utah, they're ridiculous. But, I mean, it's just things like that. They're supposed to be compliments, right? They become like a ball and chain, because if I'm not living up to that expectation where I'm always throwing the parties and I'm doing all these nice things for people and serving everything, then I'm letting people down. And it's it can be exhausting trying to keep up with all of those expectations that people have put on you.
Beautiful.
I really related to what Holly said about labeling myself, and I feel like, since the age of 12, I was very assertive in labeling myself as a Mormon and weaving that sort of rope and chain for myself in all the different circles and being very missionary-minded. And so in the process of losing my faith, I felt this almost like frantic desire to reweave a narrative, to relabel myself in a way, going back a couple slides, to gain the respect of the people that I love and value, and trying to figure out an identity that makes it's somehow still respectable but not Mormon, and be very open about that on social media. And as I'm sitting here, I'm kind of realizing that that has not given me any peace. It's just made me feel more anxious, and it hasn't even given me space to figure out who I am. I'm so busy like typing out letters and things and posts about what I'm going through, and I think what I really need is to just lay that down and to spend some time in peace and acceptance and doing the things that I know make me happy, like listening to classical music makes me very centered and peaceful. And so I need to maybe lay off the podcast, and I'm trying to memorize all the Mormon history facts to just make sure I'm not crazy, get the timeline in my head permanently, but just let that go and just do things that will be peaceful and healing.
Thank you. Put down the podcast. Let it go. You have my permission. Thank you.
I understand that I'm not a woman, but I did want to comment on this because I do have some experience with it. I had three sisters growing up. I was the only boy, and I was kind of put on this pedestal by my parents, by my sisters. I was always the one that was the peacekeeper, the helper. They'd come to me for advice. In my adult life, I was the returned missionary, the married in the temple, the financially responsible one, the one that people would come to for help. I was put on this pedestal, bound with these golden chains that make it so that when I am imperfect, when I do go through an issue or when I have a problem, my inclination was to hide it or to not let them know, because I don't want to feel vulnerable around them. I don't want them to know that I'm not imperfect, because that's how they see me. And that there is a toxicity that builds up with that. And we need to, that perfectionism is something that does wear on you and becomes very difficult.
One label that I put on myself and say all the time, because to me it just seems true, is I'm a mother. And of course it's true, I birthed 7 children. And I'm a wife. But in the construct of Mormonism, that meant a lot of things. Like you put that's what you aspire to be, is a mother. You feel like it's generations that you will be affecting. And that pressure of how important motherhood is it's the be-all, end-all. And in that spot, you put everyone, or at least I did, I put everyone above my own mental and physical health, every emotional health. And I felt like my purpose was to make sure that everyone else around me, my husband, my children, everybody, fulfilled their potential. And that my potential was not there. I mean, let's be honest. And my personality and myself and who I am just faded into nothingness, because everything was all about everyone else. I'm the only girl, and so the only daughter, and I take care of my parents, and I do all the party planning. And I was also, even growing up, I was there to to be the peacemaker of my brothers. It's just the role that I was conditioned to be in my whole life. So I just don't know, when you take those labels away, it's like I feel like I'm left with a blank slate, which is actually kind of nice and freeing to think I can choose now to be and do whatever I want to do. But also scary. So, and that gold, those gold chains aren't necessarily, I mean, I'm not wearing it today, but I actually have a gold chain necklace with all my kids' birthstones around it, you know? And maybe that will mean something new to me now. But I love my children, and I always will, but learning the balance of how to have that role and have that be part of my life, but not be who I am, is, I feel like, going to be my work. So.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I've rethought what I was going to say.
Okay.
Better not say.
Okay.
So work out fine.
Okay. I want to. So really fast. Julia de Azevedo Hanks does a lot of really great work around identity of mother. So if you follow her on Facebook or things like that, she does some really good work around that. Narrative therapy is its own theoretical framing. There's a whole theoretical framework called narrative therapy, and it's all about this kind of an idea of the stories we tell ourselves and the stories that, and how that the stories that we tell, the stories that have been passed down generationally, how they affect the stories going forward. And so it's really a beautiful concept. And I'll just, one of the things that I talk a lot about are meaning ruts. That's just kind of, I don't know, probably somebody else has coined that. Every time I think I've coined something amazing, I go look it up and somebody else already coined it. But meaning ruts, meaning, when you think about the pioneer ruts, like your wheels in the rut and you can't get out. And when you think about research, I don't know how many of you would know how to answer this, but what's the number one problem with how research is interpreted? Does anybody know? Well, basically, it's the idea that you study this one thing, and then you make the correlate that it's got to mean this, right? So if this is the result, that's what it has to mean. And that jump is where all of the mistakes are made in psychology or psychological interpretations of research. And so when you're in a meaning rut, it's kind of that same thing. It's like something has happened, and yes, our brains are wired to come up with a story of what that happening means. Part of that is actually very helpful. How many of you have seen 50 First Dates? Right, so if you had to rethink everything every day, that would take a lot of work, right? So your brain is actually supposed to be making meaning in stories, because otherwise you start off every day having to remake all this meaning, and we would never get anywhere. So it's actually a useful thing, but it can become problematic when you make incorrect meaning. And so if, for example, the fact that my husband, I don't know, maybe rejected my sexual advances, and then I'm going to assume that means I'm not sexy, or I'm not loved, or I'm not prioritized, when maybe he just has a different wiring of libido, or maybe he had a really hard day, or maybe he's been up for 15 hours. But I make that meaning. I am now in a meaning rut. And if that meaning rut becomes toxic and like repetitive, you can see how the stories we create can really cause a lot of problems. So that's just what I would add to this concept.
Noah gives a really beautiful story about the Chinese farmer. Have you guys heard this story? And this is a perfect follow-on to your comment, Natasha, about meaning ruts. So there's a farmer, an old man who's a farmer, and he has a son and a horse and a neighbor. And as the story goes, one day, the farmer's horse breaks out of the stall and runs away. And so the crazy neighbor comes running up to the old man and says, "Your life is ruined. You've lost your horse. Your farm depends on the horse. You no longer are going to be able to farm. you may as well just give up now. Your life is over. I'm so sorry for you, right? And the wise old man says, who knows what is good and what is bad? And the neighbor kind of looks at him funny and walks away. The next day, the horse comes back miraculously with 2 young mares that he found out in the pasture. And they're able to enclose the 3 horses in the corral. And all of a sudden, the farmer has 3 horses. The old man has 3 horses instead of 1. And so the crazy neighbor comes back in and says, you're the richest man in the town. You have 3 horses. You're the luckiest man in the world. You may as well just kind of like just say you've succeeded and fold it in. And again, the wise old man says, who knows what is good and what is bad? Then again, the neighbor kind of shakes his head, scratches his head, and walks away. The next day, the son was breaking in one of the mares, and he's bucked off the horse, and he breaks his leg. And now the farmer isn't going to be able to work with the son to till the ground. And predictably, the neighbor comes rushing back. Your life is ruined. Your son's broken his leg. You're going to starve to death, and you're going to die. Right? Again, he responds, who knows what is good and what is bad? Again, the neighbor's confused. And then finally, the next day, the army comes into town to conscript young men for the military service. But because the young boy had a broken leg, he wasn't carried off to war. Do you get to see kind of what's going on in the middle of that? You know, these labels, these stories, these narrative ruts that we tell ourselves. Or the golden chains of the positive narrative. We're so fortunate. We're so blessed. Aren't we amazing people? Right? Any of those things can be chains, one way or the other. When sometimes the wisdom of life is just to suspend the labels, suspend the stories, hold the emotions loosely, and just let life be what it is instead of always trying to assess it and label it and create stories from it. Now, it's time for a break, but before we end, this is the last little processing exercise before we take a break. Are any of you bound by labels or stories or emotions in a way that isn't serving you? Because it won't be useful unless we apply this to our lives. Anyone want to share?
Don't really want to talk, but I guess I will. I don't know, just the typical, I mean, I don't even say it. It sounds just perfect mom, great kids. When we were active at church, my kids knew all the answers. I must be doing something amazing at home. Now that we've left the church, I feel like everyone's just hoping that, you know, my child will go start drugs or, I don't know, something. I don't know. I just feel like I had the appearance of things were pretty amazing. And on the flip side, I was pretty confident in being a mom and teaching my kids. And now, you know, my oldest is 15, and I'm pretty open that I don't have all the answers now. And that's kind of also a scary thing.
In the back. Camille, can you raise your hand?
Okay, I'm like, I don't know when I've hit my limit. I used to restrict myself to 2 comments in Sunday school, and I've definitely exceeded that. I live with I've tried to do a lot of work. This is where I'm most focusing on progression right now, and I have the same triggers. The story that I have is related to patriarchy, and it's I put it on my husband, and I put it on my STEMinist 19-year-old daughter, that I have a story, and I don't know if have you heard of Loving What Is by Byron Katie? Big plug for that. That's really what helped me kind of deconstruct story. But she has you ask basic questions. You know, is it true? And do you know that it's true? So my story is that she respects me less. That I can't win her respect. I half think I went to law school to win like my daughter's respect. she really looks up to her father as being like sort of the source of all knowledge. The other day she was asking him legal questions. So I have a story that, I can't win her respect, that she's been taught to worship men and that she worships her father and sees him as the fount of all knowledge. And we had the opportunity to go to Nepal with our daughter. And I had a clarifying moment where I realized I need to stop demanding that she respect me, because I'll have this pissy moments where I'm like, you don't respect me, and really lived in that story. And I had one moment where we stood looking at this, gorgeous peak in the morning, and I said, you know what I need to do here, Aubrey? This is the gift that I'm going to give you this morning. I need to respect you. I need to shift the focus from trying to get you to respect me and just acknowledge what an incredible human being you are. And the wall came down and the tears flowed, and she embraced me, and it was a really teaching moment for me about story and labels.
So I guess what I want to share is kind of the labels that we're left with when our world turns upside down. And, there are some things we can leave behind when we leave the church, but there are some labels we can't. So, for instance, because I was not raised in the church, I did not want to grow up and get married and have children. That was like one of my sort of goals for my adult life. And while I am happily married, it's been really hard for me, and however this sounds, the label of mother is a really hard label for me. And I
Are you a mother?
I have 5 kids. I think that counts. That obviously served a purpose in the church. It gave me value. It gave me worth. I didn't even have to be really great at it, because all I had to do was do what the church wanted me to do with the children and show up with the kids who knew all the answers and whatever. But I'm kind of a really sucky mom, in my opinion. And I never had to work on that because I was meeting the values of the church. And so now, as I reassess my life, as many of us are doing right now, and we're deciding sort of what stays and what goes, obviously the children cannot go. And I have had to try to grapple with, okay, well, I guess now I have to figure out how to do this thing that I never wanted to do. And just as a side thing, in case anybody else has gone through this in their marriage, you always know that you have identities and labels that don't work for you when you're trying to get others to compensate. Because one tension we had, so my husband's a physician, and I used to constantly ask him about work, and it got to the point where I was like, if you're not curing preeclampsia, then you need to get to it. You need to accomplish big things because you're living for you and me. And, so while I'm stuck with the label of pregnant mom, you need to save the world because I don't get to. And so, I think there's some things we can do about the labels we have, and there's some things that just kind of we have to sort of redefine.
Beautiful. Or accept, right? Yeah. Others. Maybe let's get one or two who haven't. Is there anyone who hasn't, or who hasn't spoken, but just a little bit? Yeah, were you going to raise your hand? Go ahead. Yeah, stand up. Do it. Do it.
Mine's weird because I identify as someone that loves to serve the young women. I'm still first counselor in the young women's, and sitting through lessons is so painful. But I identify that I am someone that can serve the youth. I relate to them, they relate to me. I see that I connect with them. And so I label myself as someone that's my calling. That's my, not just like my calling, but like my heart, my calling. And I'm holding on to that label of myself that I serve the youth. But it's so painful to even go. And I don't know how to let that go, because that's my calling, and I don't know how to do my heart's desire outside of this thing. And so that's my label.
Let's do one more and then we'll take a break. Thank you. All right.
I don't really even know why I have this label for myself. I'm on ex-Mormon Reddit, and my name is Daughter of Joseph. I hate it. I named myself that. I am a direct descendant of Joseph Smith, and I've always hated that. Even as a Mormon, I've hated that I'm related to him. As a Mormon, Joseph Smith was perfect. He's next to Christ. He was perfect, and I recognize that. But the problem was my dad. My dad is. I don't want to go into who my dad is. He's a lot like who we know Joseph Smith is today. When I found out when my shelf broke, and I learned about Joseph Smith and what he did and the things that were hidden, I understood my dad. And I don't even know where I'm going with this. I guess as a Mormon, I kept it a secret, my relationship to him, because I was ashamed of, if Joseph has this preserved blood running through his veins, that's what we're taught, that he was something really special, and his blood was watched throughout all the generations to create him. And then, but his posterity, including my dad, including myself, is something that I despised. And so I kept it a secret, and now I don't even know what this means, but now I want to wear it like a badge. I'm the daughter of Joseph, because I know who he is. He really is. He is not something special. He is something that I'm angry at. I'm really angry. I'm angry at him, and I'm angry at my father, and they're a lot alike, and I understand my father now because of what I've learned about Joseph Smith. And when I learned those things, I thought, oh, surely not. I actually was like, oh, that makes so much sense. I know that's true, what I'm learning about Joseph Smith, because I know my dad. And I don't know. I don't know what that means, why I wear that. Now I can say I'm the daughter of Joseph Smith. I guess shame. I'm embarrassed. Trying to cope with who am I? Do I have those qualities? I don't know. So that's a label. And
Super powerful. Thank you.
Becca was going to say something.
Becca.
I was going to say something, and I thought it went away. I didn't think I could remember it that long. Just because my brain I feel like I'm in a fog. I'm trying to absorb everything. But I'm in therapy right now. I'm seeing, and we're doing like marriage therapy, and then I go a little bit on my own. And the man asked me the other day, what do you want? And that was the first time I think I've been asked, like, what do I want? Because I think I've spent my whole life just doing what everybody else wanted. And because I am a natural pleaser, I just was like, oh, well, you know, growing up, I went to church because that's what my parents wanted. And I went to BYU because they told me they would only help with college if I went to a church school. And, I mean, my dream was to be a marine biologist, but we all know that's not going to happen in Provo. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll go to BYU. And Rick's, I mean, they didn't have that program either. The church had to put all their schools in the desert. I don't understand that. But I think I just had never had anybody ask me that. And so for the last few weeks, I have been trying to decide, what do I want? And I still don't have any answers. And it's the weirdest thing because I'm like, man, I'm in my mid-40s, and I still have no idea what I want. Because I look at my kids and I think, gosh, here's my 20-year-old, and I'm watching her kind of go off on her adventures, and I'm like, good for you. You know more of what you want than I do. But I thought, I want to make sure that as a mom, as a parent, I'm even in my other relationships, that I'm more aware of the other person and asking what they want and not just assuming. I think that's what a lot of this is assuming and putting those labels on each other without asking those questions, because then that, I think the labels show a lack of caring, a lack of sincerity, and I want to be more caring and more sincere.
Can I just say something? Heidi, is it Heidi? I just want to say, just in that final moment when you said, I'm a daughter of Joseph, I felt power in that. I felt a lot of your personal power in that. So I'm not sure how you're interpreting that when you said shame or whatever, but I just want you to know that viscerally, I felt power from you. I just want you to know that.
Isn't it a great world where everything you say you get applauded? Why can't we do this all the time? Like, no matter anything, say something. Good job. This is all affirming, isn't it? All right, we've done great. We're 3 out of 7, and we've got 4 more to go. Clint told us to go slowly, so we're obeying Clint. No, this is beautiful. For you to make the most of your time this weekend, think about what stories or labels or emotions you might be overly identified with. And as you do your processing in the days and weeks and years ahead, how might you hold your thoughts or your stories or your labels or your emotions more loosely? And what freedom might that give you?